in Technology World Series webinar. Today we welcome Latha Matz, co-founder and chief operating officer of Zupa, to share her thoughts on Superpower or Superweapon, how we talk about opportunities and dangers of data usage with non-technical groups. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for joining in today. I think this is a really interesting topic, and it's one that we're really not going to resolve immediately. The idea that we have algorithms that can, of course, do our bidding or harm us is one that is rather new to humanity, so much so that we don't have algorithmic literacy as a part of our education programs. And so for a while, I think it's going to be up to us as technology people, as people who are thinking about tech, who are working in tech, to translate a lot of these ideas to the people in our lives. Just to get started, I find it a really interesting moment in time when, Google and Apple can kind of quit bickering and start working on a project, right? And so they are supposed to be, like, any time now, releasing an API that will be a standard for COVID-19 track and trace. And I had some other, really interesting examples of, algorithms in our lives. But I think that this is just an ideal moment to talk about how, these big companies have gotten together on this standard and how it compares to what is being done by, for example, the NHS or what's happening in China. So there are good and bad aspects. There are strengths and weaknesses, and I think it's really important that we as people in technology are able to speak about these topics with others in our lives. The stakes are very high. Obviously, the benefits would be wonderful. I'm actually really hoping for an immunization that would get rid of it. But in the meantime, I think that this is at least a tool that we can have in our tool belts. The webinar outline is here. I think you've probably seen it. We're going to talk about opportunities and risks, the algorithmic problems of neutrality and incentives, risk and bias, the limitations of perspective, and some really good ways of describing these things and worse ways of describing these things to the people in our lives. So we all have family, young and old, and none of us have gone through the kind of algorithmic analysis and training that I think we're going to need to function as parts of our community in the future. The footprint that we are all leaving is enormous. When you think about the million Tinder swipes a day, when you think about the 156 million emails that go out every day, it's a ton of information about every one of us, and you have to be almost a hermit in order to avoid that kind of data footprint. But it's not the kind of thing that we talk about, over coffee. It's not the kind of thing we tend to talk about at holiday gatherings. But maybe it should be. We're also affected by the coronavirus, and that is something that you might be asked about by, say, your Aunt Sophie. So great Aunt Sophie asks you, well, how do these track and trace programs work? What are the benefits to me? And what do you say to that? Well, one of the things that Apple and Google have done is they've made a really public and transparent standard that they've already released some information on. Obviously, when we get the full standard, when they actually do release it, there might be some changes to it. But they've put out, for example, this sample public health authority app onboarding process as an example of what they would consider to be a best practice in this area. Further, they published this situation between Alice and Bob. And I think this is a pretty good way of talking about something that is rather complex, something that, great Aunt Sophie might have questions about, and making it a little bit more understandable. So first off, they're using characters. They're using relatable characters. Bob looks pretty stressed out here, the kind of person that we can relate a little bit more to. So this kind of presentation of the information is obviously better than giving Great Aunt Sophie the details of the standard in a big text document. It's just not going to be as absorbable. And further, it's visual. So we've got a good story with a good visual, and it's kind of a simple presentation here, where they're talking about the exchange of anonymous identifier beacons. Now, you might need to explain what a beacon is, but even just looking at this visual, I think you can get an idea of that kind of near field technology that's happening there. And you can talk about some of the things that make this a little bit more private, a little bit more safe, if you are concerned about having people know where you are at all times, for example, which, some of the tracking apps actually are doing that kind of location tracking. So further, you see in the Apple and Google example that here's Alice. She's obviously at home. She's reading a book. She's drinking a hot beverage. Alice, again, a relatable character. And this is the kind of process that we can much more reasonably, I think, explain to lots of people in our communities. When we compare that to some of the other tracking applications and the ways in which people are trying to describe those applications, I think there is a lot more that you have to dig through to understand what the standard is, and there's a lot less information that is maybe relatable to the general public. So let's look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think you can have complaints about the Apple Google proposed standard. I think as far as trade-offs go, it's probably the best standard out there. The bad, I would personally put up the NHS app as probably not the best way to go about this. There are a few problems with the NHS app. One of them is that they do have a centralized database where they are collecting a zip code, right? They are collecting the user's phone information and correlating that to their symptoms. So this is a very different way of just onboarding somebody into the app. And it's also, if you look at their terms and conditions, they have specified that they're going to keep all of this information and that they might correlate it with other databases in the future. That's not necessarily, GDPR compliant if you're familiar with the general data protection principles. One of them is that, you're collecting minimal information and you're keeping it for, the minimum amount of time to bring value to the end user, essentially. So the NHS system, they may make changes to it. They've already mentioned that they're building a second variety of the application. They have pushed back a little bit on using the Google Apple standard, but it remains to be seen if they will actually roll this out to the population. Interesting. And I think if we want to talk about the kind of ugly version of a trace and track app, I made this illustration because I couldn't find one that was useful. But you can see here that after this character, Joe, downloads the app and registers with his name, with his ID, and with his current symptoms, he needs to scan in at the grocery store. He needs to scan in to ride the buses, the trains. If he goes to a cafe, he would need to scan in there as well. And that information, it's a little more unclear because they really have kind of a black box on the back end, but it is typically an alignment between the Chinese government and Alipay or WeChat. So they're also getting the transaction purchase information in the case of Alipay, and probably going to a server that the Chinese authorities have. Now, this isn't anything new for China. They do track people and they make a point of devaluing individual privacy when it comes to public good. And that's, a decision on the part of the Chinese government. But it's not the kind of system that is safe for an individual who wants to criticize that system, and it's certainly not safe from hacking, which we can get into in a little bit. But, back to Aunt Sophie, right? What could go wrong? Well, there's a lot that could go wrong. In the case of the Chinese tracking system, they have gathered so much personal information. They're gathering it into a central database. So you have issues of hacking, you have issues of obviously government surveillance, and if the information could get into the hands of people who want to do you harm, there's nothing to stop them, really. So the Google Apple system is stored on your phone, right? It's stored locally, and the things that go wrong with the Apple and Google system would be, for example, if you had a neighbor who was very nosy and they were, taking surveillance footage of everybody who walked by their house, they could theoretically correlate the data from that near-field contact with Bluetooth to identify people if they came down with COVID and then needed to inform others who had come within their radius. So that's the kind of much smaller and less probable harm that you see with, for example, the Apple-Google system. When we think about algorithms generally, there are some problems. And I think it's important to be able to talk about those as well with Aunt Sophie. So first off is neutrality and incentives. And I'm going to throw up Jafar here because, I hope everybody understands Aladdin and how Jafar really represents the kind of person who is a bad advisor. So this is the first kind of risk that you see, I think, with algorithms. And, probably because Jafar is a pop culture reference, he's a good starting point for talking about how not every advisor is on your side. Not every advisor is working in the same interests as you, right? If Jafar is your advisor, he's probably going to be giving you advice that puts him into a position of more power. Similarly, your algorithm might be giving you advice which is actually in the interests of the company that created it. So that is one way in which an algorithm can be really not working in your best interests. Next, I think we can talk a little bit about risk. And I throw the clouds up here because I think one of the great things that we can talk about when we talk about data is the weather. Like everybody in your family has an opinion on the weather. They all have an understanding of, Phil, the meteorologist, who's on their news channel, or the predictions that are on their phone device for the weather. And, when you think about how much data exists out there about weather patterns over time, and the fact that weather is really based on data patterns from the past, we can see that one of the risks in algorithmic predictions is that they really are based on the past. We can bring up Corona here too, because who was thinking, back in November of last year, or maybe when they were making their resolutions, one of my resolutions for 2020 is going to be staying alive and out of the global pandemic. Nobody was thinking about that. And so, whether you're thinking about, interesting weather conditions, we can only really predict well, 3 to 5 days in the future. Once you get to 7 to 10 days, it's a coin flip on whether we can actually predict what's happening. Part of that is complex systems, but part of it is also we have based that information on past performance, and the future really is a big unknown. Also, when we talk about basing things on past performance, it's handy to talk about the black swan. Now, this is a metaphor that was produced to talk about how we can really believe that all swans are white, but it took years and years before people went to Australia and discovered, oh, there are black swans. Look at that. They had only an idea of swanness from their own history. So the black swan is a really good metaphor and a good idea of how, for example, you can have a really bad algorithmic prediction of the future based on just limited knowledge of what could happen. Finally, when I talk about risk, I want to talk about false negatives and false positives. And I use the X-rays here because I think that, and for example, also for COVID-19 testing, is a good way of talking about how you want to bias your systems. Because, for example, when it comes to mistakes, there's always going to be margin of error. There's always going to be mistakes. Do you want those mistakes to be false positives or false negatives? In the case of tumors, and if you're looking for tumors on X-rays, if you're programming your algorithm to do that, you want them to be looking for things that are possibly tumors, but actually not tumors. You would rather scare a person and tell, we have something that we're looking into that we think would be a tumor, and then, have them be happy, rather than just completely missing a tumor. In the same way, the false positive is the way you want to go with COVID-19 analysis. If you're going to get it wrong, it's better to check people out and double check and make sure that they really don't have COVID-19, rather than missing a COVID-19 diagnosis and not giving them the right information at all. So we bias our algorithms, we bias our decisions, and whether we're doing that ourselves or whether we are exporting that to our machines, we have to consider what causes the least harm. And finally, perspective. And I think that's an important one to think about as well, because I think a lot of people who are not technical folks think that algorithms have, all of the information. They have ideas that the machines have, access to everything, and therefore the kind of output they're going to give is complete. But I mean, it's not. And so we see this coming up in the newspaper. For example, if you remember the fires in California, the map algorithm saw empty streets and would send drivers down these empty streets into fires. The algorithm could only see so much. And what the algorithm saw and what the algorithm was looking for were empty streets to better route the traffic. Now, the perspective that the algorithm has is of course going to be limited. The same thing you can see with, for example, COVID-19. If you look at death tracking, there are people who are dying at home of unknown, untested causes. Those people are not necessarily considered COVID-19 deaths. And so you can end up with bad information just through omission. And that's another one of these risks. And I think it's easy to explain some of these limitations to people like Aunt Sophie, but it helps to have some analogies to talk about them and some examples, for example, from the past. So a good question, what are they going to do with all that data? And I think is kind of an open question. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We can talk about some of the things that could happen. And I think, it's really useful, of course, to talk about all the wonderful things that we get from algorithms. For example, we get the weather reports, right? We get the predictions. We get predictions about what songs we might like that go onto our Spotify playlist, and that's a wonderful use of an algorithm. Or for example, my stepdad loves Siri. These are tools that are based on algorithms that we use every day. But also, there are risks. I think those benefits are really easy to talk about. The risks, I think we have to go into a little more detail and maybe use some additional tools to make it easier to understand. So first off, just talking about our footprint in general. I mentioned some things about how our data footprints are huge and how they're becoming even more huge. If you have a phone, if you live in a city, if you are leaving the house, if you're not a complete hermit, you're leaving a data footprint. And what does that mean? It means different things depending on which country you live in. So I live here in Berlin, and so I'm subject to the GDPR guidelines, which are for protection of the citizens of the EU. That doesn't apply to people in China. That doesn't apply to people in South America. So your situation can really vary depending on where you live. And I think that's also an important point to make to people like Aunt Sophie. Your government may enforce certain protections for you, or it may not. So one of the questions about what they're doing with your information is, are they evil or are they stupid? Sometimes it doesn't matter if they're evil, because if they've done some bad things with their data storage processes, it can go into the hands of somebody who's evil. And I think a really great example of how this happens is the website Have I Been Pwned? Now, I'm sure that some of you are familiar with this one already. You can see one of my email addresses I plugged in there, and yes, I have been pwned on 16 breached sites. So what this system essentially does is it shows you where your email address is showing up on the dark web. And this is a great way to, sit down with Aunt Sophie or with anybody else in your family and just do it together. I think it is a great opportunity to talk about the different companies who have kind of sold you out. And so you can see these are some of the 16 companies that have done me wrong. And the site actually gives you pretty clear information about what of your information went out into the dark web, essentially. I don't know if you can guess here which one of these I'm kind of the most angry about, but I will reveal it right now. It's Evite. I'm very angry at Evite because in their April 2019 data breach, it showed that they were using names, phone numbers, physical addresses, dates of birth, genders, and passwords, which were stored in plain text. And that's just stupid. So if you're a person who is in technology, you know that you don't store people's private information in plain text. That's number one. Two, they had this information which was being accessed back to 2013. So they were storing this data for a long period in a centralized server. And additionally, why do they need my gender? Why do they need my physical address and phone number? Releasing this information means that somebody could come and track me down if they wanted to. I'm not saying that it's super likely, but this kind of data breach is the kind of thing you can sit down and talk about with members of your family once it is apparent that the companies have actually been victim of this. I saw that there was another company, EasyJet, had a data breach as well. But you can see the details of those data breaches and how they were actually protecting your information when it went out into the hands of evildoers. Another good illustration of how you can kind of interact with people in your family to show them the actual effect of different companies, how much data they're taking from you, and how they're storing and using it. So yeah, a big face slap there. But a further question, Aunt Sophie, how will I know if they're creepy or stupid before I give them my information? Well, I've got kind of a list because I think everybody needs some kind of rules of thumb. You don't need to know about a lot of data storage methods, or you don't need to know about a lot of the details of the technology if you can kind of get a sense for if the company that you're giving your information to is being creepy with it. And what I would tell Aunt Sophie is, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it might be a duck. So here are my kind of rules of thumb around, is it a creepy app? Is it a duck? If the product is free, that's the first thing. If you don't understand their business model, if you don't understand how they make money, it could be your data. It could be you. That's how they're making money. That's very clear in the case of Facebook, for example. Is the product bringing you value in exchange for the data you provide for them? A good example of this used to be Foursquare, where you would just go to a place and check in and you could become the mayor of your local cafe. But that's really not much value in exchange for all of the data that people were giving them over time. These days they're doing reviews and making things more personalized for people, but I'm still not sure if it's enough to justify giving all of your location over to Foursquare all the time. Is their data minimal and relevant? And here I would say, remember that Evite example. Like, was it really relevant for them to have my gender? Was it really minimal of them to have every piece of information on me and store it poorly? No, not minimal and relevant. They consistently ask for your consent. This is going to be a powerful one in those track and trace tools as well. If they are updating the app, if they're changing the app, if they need to collect more information, are they asking you before they do that? And is it voluntary? Is it revocable? In the case of Evite, for example, I don't think there was any way for me to delete all of my information. And equality, something else to think about just on a societal basis. Are there alternatives for those people who can't or don't wish to use the database technology? In the case of the track and trace IDs, there's billions of people who don't have a compatible smartphone. So they would not even necessarily be eligible. And in China, that means they're not getting into the supermarket, which is a pretty big harm. Do they openly explain their security methods and privacy controls in plain language? Now, that's a policy that GDPR here in Europe requires, that you must explain your security methods and privacy controls in language that is understandable. If the app doesn't, if they're hiding that, and if they're hiding the standards by which they are, for example, information exchange, they might be creepy. And you can see that in the Chinese example as well. They're not really clear about it. Transparency. Is there clarity into the permissions you've given? Is the data that they have and their retention policies, is that clear? And do they have a DIPA, which is an analysis of the data protection information, or a GDPR statement? These things are kind of good signs. And if they are not holding on to your data forever and ever, that's also a good sign. So that's one of the other complaints about the NHS application, if you remember, is that they're holding on to your data for an undisclosed amount of time, and they could be correlating it with other data sets. And can you easily delete the app and the data they've gathered? In the case of our app, Super, which is a finance app, we do gather people's banking data so that we can analyze it and give them insights about their accounts. But you can easily delete the app and delete all of its data. So that's one of the ways in which we try to be not creepy, because you should have that control. Have they had prior data breaches? This is public information. Sometimes it can be harder to find, but certainly on Have I Been Pwned, you can see a lot of the really public data breaches that have happened. Additionally, you can see how they've reacted to those data breaches. Do they take appropriate steps afterward? Do they hide it? That's an interesting one, where you read about companies that had a data breach and then suppressed the information and didn't mention it to any of their users. In the case of Kickstarter, I remember that they made everybody reset their information and sent out very specific emails about how to do that after they had their data breach. So one could say that that's a better way of managing that kind of process. And finally, probability or severity of harm. So what's the worst thing that could happen if your data was breached? Is it a severe outcome, and is it a likely outcome? In the case of my nosy neighbor who is taking surveillance and pictures of everybody who walks by and then corresponding that with their Bluetooth information, if I came up with COVID and he, had my picture and put it up on a public website, he could do that, and he could certainly embarrass me, but that is probably less harm than the harm that could come to a person through some of the location tracking and privacy issues that we've seen. For example, just a recent example in Pakistan, where two girls were filmed with a boy, and then a year later, that video was posted and they were killed by their families in an honor killing. So that was privacy violation, which turned into a death. And so is it embarrassment? Is it danger? And how likely is it that embarrassment or danger comes to you? Those are some considerations to think about when you think about the data that you're releasing and what impact it could have on your life. We have satisfied Aunt Sophie's questions. Obviously, I'm a software person, not a hardware person, so I can't help with the TV remote, but I can say that I think we have a few tools here for how to talk about the relationships, how to talk about the logic and the possibilities of what could happen. So I think I've used probably every one of these communication techniques within this session. And so hopefully you were able to get something out of the pictures, the cartoons, the infographics, the analogies and the metaphors. And then I hope you will actively participate and go check out your Have I Been Pwned information for yourself. And, maybe in the Q&A, you can tell me if any of these examples have had personal resonance for you. And obviously, if it's appropriate and you think you can pull it off, a little humor never hurts. So I will end on something that I find humorous, which is an XKCD slide here. I think that's always appropriate for tech audiences and maybe even non-tech audiences. But I will say thank you. And yeah, if you have questions, if you have experiences in talking to your families and friends, maybe your neighbors about these topics, I would love to hear about that as well.
A couple of questions that have come in, but just firstly, thank you so much for running through that webinar. I'm sure that I'm not the only one. The references were great and really sort of relevant, understandable, from the weather to Jafar. Great references. So the first question that I have to ask is, it was really interesting to see your thoughts on how these recent developments affect GDPR issues. COVID could be seen as an opportunity for big tech or governments to really overstep their lines for data breaches. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, and that is one of the concerns because, for example, Apple and Google standard is a standard, right? Like this is going to be a part of your phone, and the idea that it could be subject to future police action. Somebody could subpoena that information, or somebody could use that and go further with it, gather more information. So, for example, one of the things that Google and Apple have suggested is that, look, this is our standard. You're building apps on top of it. And if you require that a person put in a lot more personal data, we're not going to support that. That is one way in which they are currently kind of trying to tamp down some of the overreach that could happen. But that's today. We can't we can't make promises about what happens tomorrow, or what happens 5 years from now. We don't know how judges will rule about subpoenas for this kind of information. And we don't know what hackers will do to manipulate your phone system to root your device to get in and get the information that's actually on your phone. So yeah, there are some risks. I think that given the life and death scenario, the Google-Apple system and the potential for harm is reduced, especially if they discontinue the standard after the COVID-19 situation is resolved. But there's no guarantee they will. There's no guarantee they won't extend it. So
yeah,
up in the air.
Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty, you could say, with almost everything.
Everything.
Another question that we have is, how do we explain the value and importance of our data? So this is something that I was thinking about sort of throughout your examples, like how do we even show that data is so valuable? Like, I can already think of examples trying to explain it and they're just like, but what could they really do with it? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question, and there's an upside for you with having more data. For example, so two parts of that question. I think what are the upsides for you as an individual with having your data analyzed? I mean, you can know things about your DNA and your medical situations that might develop for you, or your drug interactions. These are things that are now available to us if we choose to do some data sharing and allow the algorithm to analyze what's going on actually with our DNA. Or, for example, if you think about the information that you get from sports tracking apps, you can actually learn a lot about your body processes. How is your sleep? If you use a sleep tracker, you can learn how to sleep better over time. There are decision support upsides. For example, we're only available to kings and pharaohs and generals and people in the past who had staffs. And actually, I have a whole different talk about what amazing powers just the everyday person has now thanks to algorithms. So we can talk about how they can really make us into super people, people that we couldn't have been 10 or 20 years ago. But on the other side, you can look at, for example, the harms that have come to people from data privacy issues. So things that have happened in the real world have been, for example, Strava is a sports app that helps people track their runs, helps people track their bike rides, and they didn't realize that they were actually helping people identify where secret government bases were. And it turned out that a lot of soldiers were using the Strava app to track their runs, track their exercise regimens, and that was being publicly displayed. And so you could look on a map and see, oh, look, there's 50 guys who are going for runs around this particular ring out here in the desert. Do you think perhaps that's a secret government base? Well, yeah, it was. And so they had to do some changes to prevent those soldiers from being in undue danger due to the data tracking. There are also a lot of examples of people who, for example, like those two girls who, they were just being teenagers, and yet when that information came out, it was actually a life and death scenario for them, right? They were the victims of the privacy violation, essentially. And that happens to people too, especially people in countries where somebody doesn't like their sexuality or somebody doesn't like their opinion. That's a real danger.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate as well all of the sort of tips and tricks that you provided in regards to how we can be a bit smarter with what we're sort of working with technology-wise, apps, things to look out for. So I guess just the opposite side, I guess, and our final question is there any way to pull back the data that's already out there?
Yeah, I mean, you can, with any company that is operating in Europe, they have to, if you write to them and say, I would like you to delete all of my data, they must. In the United States, for example, Facebook and actually a lot of the companies that are doing ad tracking, they have to tell you, if you ask, what information they have on you. And so Facebook actually has a tool to allow you to do that, to see what kind of a profile they've developed on you. You can erase your history within, for example, Firefox. They have some specific tools around allowing you to erase your browsing history. And also you can open private sessions, for example, so that you won't be tracked if you're, looking up information about your period cramps or something, and you don't want the world to know about that. You can open up one of these incognito windows, and that's something that you can share with your friends and family as well. Like, this is how you open up an incognito window and run an embarrassing search. So there are some methods, but they're not always super easy to find.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the incognito option, I think, is becoming more and more important, especially as we're building, I guess, a more online life, and everything is online now. And so that is the end of all the questions. And that was such an informative session. I have already been on Have I Been Porn? So I would advise everyone to check that out and see what's happened with your data. But thank you so much, Latha.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's a pleasure.